In our last conversation, we began to change the topic from how advances in the physical sciences led to our redefining of material reality to considerations about the nature of reality stemming from the study of life. In this discussion, we're going to lay out the picture of reality that was in place in the life sciences at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, and explain where it came from. In order to see how we redefined reality in the biological sciences in the face of scientific and technological advancement, we need to understand first how we originally defined that reality. As with the physical sciences, the biological sciences trace their roots back to Aristotle. Recall that Aristotle's worldview, like all the Greek thinkers of his time, was teleological. That means that all change is originated within the thing changing and is geared towards a goal or an aim of that thing. Now, for earthly chemical elements, that meant seeking their natural place in the universe by moving towards it in a straight line. For living things, however, the goal is a bit more abstract. Remember that Aristotle was a student of Plato. And Plato said that reality was not to be found in the material world, since material objects are imperfect. Change for Plato is also teleological, and if something is changing, it's trying to reach its goal, which makes it imperfect. A perfect thing would have no reason to change since it had reached its goal. So, what's real is not what we find in the material world, but rather the perfect, idealized conception of it. Plato called these forms, and they reside not in the world of material things that we see with our eyes, but in the eternally unchanging world of forms, which we see with the eye of the mind. A table maker becomes more expert at making tables, right? Over the years, through experience and experiment, he'll make better and better tables. But his tables are never perfect. No material table ever could be. Being a table maker, he begins work not with his hands, but with his head. He sees the form of the table, and then gets better and better at making the imperfect physical representations more and more like the perfection he's come to understand through his contemplation of tableness. Aristotle thought that this world is the real world, but he did incorporate the view of his teacher into his understanding of it. These perfect, unchanging forms, of which all material things are imperfect representations, are taken out of the ethereal world of forms and packed into the living things themselves. All living things, from their earliest state, contain within them a potentiality, an essence, and the course of their lives is the history of them trying to actualize their potential. The acorn has within it the notion of the mighty oak it's striving to become. Aristotle thinks that all things are made up of matter and form, substance and structure. And the changes in both result from the organism trying to reach its potential, a potential which is a part of it and which remains the same for all members of the same species. In the process of reproduction, the potentiality is encoded in the organism. In the case of humans, for example, who reproduce sexually, the mother's contribution is the matter. That is, the mother provides the stuff that will form the body. But the father's contribution is the soul, the form, the plans, the essence of humanness, which the matter will take. For Aristotle, the notion of a soul is different from the Christian concept in some ways. So for Aristotle, the soul is simply the source of change and growth. Any organized thing that changes itself has a soul. Since all change is goal-directed, something must be directing it. That's the soul. Plants grow, so they have souls that direct growth. Animals not only grow, they also move. So they must have more complex souls with plant-like parts to guide their growth and another part to account for their more intricate interactions with their environment. Humans have souls with plant-like and animal-like portions, but also a uniquely human element since we have intellectual aspects to us. The study of biology, then, according to Aristotle, is the study of these potentialities, these forms, the essential properties that make each species unique and the properties that some species share in common. Biology, therefore, has two steps. First, the scientist has to carefully document the anatomy of the organism. Then, through observation, determine the essence of the species, find out the goal of that species. Second, the scientist must incorporate it into an organized catalog of all species. We group the species according to common elements in their essences. When the Church discovered Aristotle and took over his scientific views as official doctrine, the biological elements, like those in the physics, were easily adapted for theological purposes. No longer were plants and beasts thought to have souls, but they did have plans, and these were placed inside based upon the ultimate blueprint for creation. We could still account for anatomical differences and categorize species, but now the list of species could have an order of perfection imposed upon them. We could list all beings from the lowest to the highest, with humans near the top, angels above them, and finally God occupying the number one position in this hierarchy of perfection. It was the great chain of being, and every organism was in a species, and every species had a place on the earth and a place in the great chain. It was fixed and immutable, perfect as the God who created it. So, when the work of the British naturalist Charles Darwin suggested that species developed over time, adapting dynamically to changing environments, it challenged the Church's account in radical ways. If species evolve, change, and develop over time, then that means they were not perfect to begin with. A perfect creator would create a perfect creation. In terms we inherit from Leibniz, the best of all possible worlds. If the world is changing, then either it was the best of all possible worlds and now is not, or it wasn't the best of all possible worlds and now it is, or it's on its way to becoming it eventually. Either way, God's creation would demonstrate a degree of imperfection incompatible with God's absolute perfection. It should be that it was, is, and always will be the best of all possible worlds. But Darwin showed that the plans according to which organisms develop are not fixed. The properties of species change over time in accordance with selection procedures that determine from the outside, not the inside, which features of the species will remain. And these changes are not progressive. They don't proceed according to some larger plan according to which things become more perfect. Species merely adapt themselves to the current circumstances, which themselves will change for no reason and in accord with no plan. The larger teleological aspects of the Aristotelian system, which were so easily and naturally adopted and adapted by the Church, were removed from Darwin's picture. A stable world in which God carefully placed things in order where they belonged was replaced with a picture in which imperfect structures adapted themselves to each other, spurring the idea of a dynamically changing world in continuous flux. We associate the name Darwin with evolution, but famously, he was met there by another man, Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace was a younger naturalist who was in contact with Darwin. Darwin had the idea first. We know this from his writings. But Darwin was a nervous sort of fellow, not someone who relished conflict. He knew how radical and revolutionary his ideas were, so he was taking a long time, a very long time, to put them into print. There were two reasons. First, he was not going to publish until he could set out the case in an ironclad form. He knew how much resistance he would face, and he was going to collect evidence and bolster the support with arguments from animal husbandry, from archaeology, from geology, from every seemingly disconnected corner of science he could, showing everything pointed to his conclusion. He was being so careful, taking so much time, that Wallace jumped to the same conclusion, not knowing Darwin's thought. The second reason it was taking Darwin so long was that he was still alive. Darwin thought that his work should be released posthumously. One way of not having to answer angry critics is to simply be dead. Darwin was ill much of his adult life and figured it wouldn't be too long until his demise anyway, he would just wait it out. But One day, in the mail, he received a correspondence from Wallace, and there it was. The core of the theory he had been working on for years. If Wallace published first, then all his work would be for nothing. But he couldn't publish now that he saw Wallace's work. From Wallace's vantage point, what would that look like? Wallace had a great revolutionary idea, sent it to Darwin, and next thing you know, Darwin publishes the same idea under his name. It would be intellectual property theft of the most craven variety. Darwin was in a bind. What would he do? What could he do? He sought help from one of his old professors, Charles Lyell, one of the most respected names in science at the time, and a path forward was developed. Darwin would write up his own short version of his work, inform Wallace that he had had the idea as well, and the two would publish together in the same journal at the same time. Since Darwin's version was so much farther along, so much better developed, it was Darwin's name alone that became associated with the theory of adaptive speciation by evolution. Darwin's theory can be set out in terms of 4 basic principles, each one based on experience. 1. Children look like their parents. 2. Children don't look exactly like their parents. 3. You have to be alive to have children. 4. You have to get a date before you have children. These 4 simple propositions combine to give us Darwin's theory of evolution. Let's look at them individually and see how they work together to give us what, at the time, was a radical result. Okay, 1. Children look like their parents. The idea is that there are certain traits that are heritable, passed along from generation to generation. We've all heard people say things like, "You have your mother's eyes." The idea is that there are certain family resemblances that are not widely shared outside the family and so come from being a part of the family. Darwin raised fancy pigeons, a hobby that had quite a number of practitioners at that time. He knew that if you wanted a certain trait in your next generation of pigeons, you should find breeding pairs with that property. Farmers had been selectively breeding for centuries. Want bigger, stronger horses? Find a big, strong stallion and a big, strong mare, and you'll get bigger, stronger horses. Want smaller horses? Find smaller stallions and smaller mares, right? This was not news to anyone that there were traits that could be passed down. 2. Children don't look exactly like their parents. While many traits are heritable, offspring will occasionally exhibit new traits for seemingly no good reason. Children will look like their parents, but they'll always have some traits that were present in neither parent. These random mutations just popped up. Sometimes they were good things, sometimes they weren't. Sometimes they could be passed to the offspring, sometimes they couldn't. If you like this new twist in pigeons, take the one with the mutation and breed it to see if the chicks share the property. And if so, breed them until you have a bunch with the new property. If you select strange enough properties and breed only those with that set of properties, separate them off from the original population, you'll eventually develop a group of organisms that will bear little resemblance to the others. In isolated areas where there are physical and geographical boundaries separating populations so that interbreeding becomes impossible, the result will be groups of organisms that are very much unlike each other. Ultimately, these differences can amount to sufficient change that you will have speciation, the emergence of a completely new species, a new type of organism. 3. You have to be alive to have children. This is the well-known doctrine of natural selection. It begins with the presupposition that the world is a dangerous place in which not only is the stuff you need to survive limited in quantity, but that you are the stuff some other sort of animal needs to survive. When Darwin set sail as the ship's naturalist on the voyage of the HMS Beagle, he took a number of books with him. A title that one of his old professors told him would be interesting but not to take too seriously was An Essay on the Principle of Population by Thomas Robert Malthus, a clergyman and social theorist. England in the 19th century had a very stratified social structure. Rich were rich, poor were poor. Education and the finer things in life were not available to all, and social advancement was not an option for those born on the wrong side of the divide. Progressive programs to help the poor, to expand voting rights, and to limit the power of the aristocratic class were in the air. Malthus argued that while the moral impulse to help the less well-off may come from a good place, putting such actions into effect could be disastrous. He begins with a pair of mathematical claims. The first is that, through effort and ingenuity, humans are capable of producing more of that which we need to survive with each passing generation. Through more efficient means of manufacturing, greater population, and thus more workers, and advances in technology, the production of that which satisfies our most basic needs will increase over time. But it will increase, he contends, in an arithmetic progression. If we could grow a bushel of apples from our land this generation, the next we could grow 2, and the following grow 3, and so on, progressing in this linear way. The problem, Malthus argued, is human reproduction. If you give people enough food, warmth, and shelter, if you give us what we need to survive, then our one-track minds turn to one specific thing, and that results in babies. Humans who are comfortable reproduce at a rate such that each generation is not arithmetically larger, but exponentially. If people have 4 kids, and their 4 kids each have 4 kids, and their 4 kids each have 4 kids, the population explodes. But since resources are only growing linearly, while population is growing exponentially, the population will quickly outgrow the resources. This means there will be intense competition for limited goods, the goods needed for survival. As a result, Malthus argued, you get a crash in population due to mass starvation. An ugly, ugly way to go. So, if you think it's a good idea to help feed the poor, think again. We all know the poor have more kids, so the last thing we want to do is give them food which will only lead to more of them. Eventually, their numbers will swell to the point where resources will be stretched so thin that even the wealthy and educated, the worthy, the real humans, will suffer. Helping the needy only causes suffering in those too good to need. It causes hardship and death for all of humanity. So, if you really care, the best thing to do is to starve the needy, keep them from multiplying, and save the balance in resources, especially save the distribution. Now, Darwin was a political progressive. He did not buy the policy prescription from Malthus, but he did see in it a reflection of the natural world he was observing. Survival is a serious task, not something to be taken for granted. There is a constant competition for scarce resources within a species and danger from others. Organism is going to be successful in passing on its properties. It needs to procreate, and for this, you need to survive. The random mutations that pop up will most likely not be a help to survival. Indeed, most are a detriment. Since this is the case, the probability of the organism with the deficiency living to have children is decreased, and over time, the deficiency will disappear from the population. But in the rare case that the mutation conveys a positive trait, an aid in surviving, there's a greater likelihood that the organism will procreate, and therefore a higher probability that the trait will not only continue on, but increase its appearance in the population. As Malthus pointed out, successful elements for survival can lead to an exponential growth in population. And so, the positive feature would spread through the future generations of the populations quite successfully. But while surviving is necessary for procreation, it's not sufficient. This leads to our 4th pillar of Darwinian theory. Number 4, you have to get a date before you can have children. As many scientists can tell you from their high school and college experiences, you are quite alive on lonely Friday nights. It takes 2 to tango in both the literal and figurative biological senses, and mate selection becomes important in terms of the ability to spread properties through a population over generations. Why do we see colorful plumage on male birds when such displays would make them easier to find by predators and therefore a liability in terms of survival? The answer is sexual selection. That is, it makes them also more likely to be found attractive by potential female mates. The more attractive you're found, the more likely you are to mate, and thereby the more likely you are to pass on your properties to the next generation. So, put these 4 simple statements together. 1. Children look like their parents. 2. Children don't look exactly like their parents. 3. You have to be alive to have children. And 4. You have to get a date before you can have children, and you have the basis of Darwin's theory. It forced a radical shift in the way we see the world. While nature may be well ordered with interlocking parts, no longer is it a static system. Not only do we fail to see the sort of eternal regularity that led Einstein to posit a cosmological constant into his field equations violated, but once again, we see randomness inserted into the order. But while these aspects of the theory were bothersome to our view of reality, the real shock came when Darwin applied this to the history of humanity. In the great chain of being, our status as superior to the rest of creation was fixed and assured. We were created in the image of God, and therefore not only higher, but a different category than mere animals. But with his work, The Descent of Man, Darwin does bring humans down into the realm of nature. We are animals, some of us more than others. We were created through a process from the world. We're not unique. We're not special in the ways we thought. Copernicus removed the Earth from the center of the universe. Darwin did the same for humanity. Perhaps the greatest cultural influence was the sense of pessimism this conveyed. When the universe could be seen as well-ordered, as static, it could be thought of as created for us. It was made to be our home and to nourish us. The universe was a friendly place, and so we too should reflect its amicability. But now, we were just another sort of animal in a world hostile to animals and hostile with animals. To be successful, we must adapt. We must become fierce. The result was the adaptation of Darwin's thesis to social policy, something Darwin himself quite disliked. Combining the political thought of figures like Herbert Spencer with the Darwinian view of nature, a group of writers at the time created what came to be called as social Darwinism. It holds that our empathetic and sympathetic natures needed to be kept in check, much as Malthus would have had for the sake of the species. If survival pressures are necessary for development, then acting out of kindness to assuage the suffering of individuals, the poor, the hungry, the needy, might seem at first glance like a good idea, but charity for one is a pox on us all. You're not really helping that person, but weakening the species. By helping the less fit amongst us survive through social programs and government aid is keeping those who should be winnowed out of the gene pool. If we are animals, then for our own sake, we better darn well start acting like it. One of the most striking portrayals of this appeared a century after Darwin, with the English Nobel laureate William Golding's classic novel, Lord of the Flies. In it, we literally see the descent of man when upper-class British boys become stranded on an island. At first, they form a version of adult society with the equivalent of political and social institutions designed to serve the common good and protect equality and support the well-being of all. But step by step, the wilder among them break off and acquire power. As the boys shed their culture, they lose what we would identify as their humanity, ultimately becoming murderous savages. Removed from the structure and enforcement mechanisms of human society with its social contract, the boys reverted to their base animal selves. While Golding's book is considered one of the great works of English language fiction in the 20th century, we see versions of this work in lowbrow entertainment as well. Indeed, it's the basis for what we now call reality television. We can trace the roots of reality television back to Alan Funt's magnificent program Candid Camera, which ran in the late 1940s intermittently through the early 2000s. The aim of Candid Camera was innocent. Put unsuspecting people in a position in which unexpected things happen and see their reactions. Not their reactions as they would have us see them, but as they really are. Candid camera was so beloved in part because it stripped away the masks we wear as members of contemporary Western society and reveal us for the people we are. But it did it in a safe environment, one in which the elicited responses were cute and funny, and in which the mark was let off the hook quickly, let in on the joke, and could laugh along. But in the 1990s, the format was changed. The boys from Lord of the Flies also found plenty to laugh about in the early period of their time on the island. But things changed when you changed the world. The world of candid camera is much like the world of pre-Darwinian biology. It was created for the mark, with the creator intentionally putting in elements where the mark's well-being were kept in mind. But when we moved to the early reality shows of the 1990s and early 2000s, the point was to keep the contestants in an environment where they felt constantly threatened and where response to the threat was paramount to the chances of remaining in the competition. From American Gladiator to The Real World to Big Brother, the aim was to create a world reminiscent of Alfred Lord Tennyson's sense of nature red in tooth and claw. The idea was to make sure that the claws came out. If we watched human behavior closely enough, we would see the animal nature peeking through. This was nowhere more apparent than the program Survivor, which sought to clearly model Golding's plot, take people away from contemporary society, place them in an isolated environment, indeed one that very much resembles the setting of Lord of the Flies, and watch them, unscripted, repeat its plot, in some cases metaphorically, in some cases literally. But an interesting adaptation has occurred. Following these programs, a host of other reality television shows have flourished, which are, in deeper ways, quite Darwinian. In these programs, there's still an element of survival of the fittest, in which there are competitions and the winner advances and the losers are removed from the population. But in all of these, the key to advancing is creative adaptation. These programs focus on aspects of human culture, like fashion in Project One Way, vocal performance in American Idol, humor in Last Comic Standing, culinary arts in Top Chef, and so many more. In these cases, we have a Lord of the Flies type setup, but the result is not mere brutality and animal-like fierceness, although those are certainly present. Rather, the key to survival in these artificial environments is creative adaptation. Using materials or ingredients that would be thought thoroughly unexpected, create something new, something interesting. The judges on these programs are harsh, imitating the selection pressures in a natural ecosystem. If an adaptation is not advantageous, it causes the organism who presents it to be eliminated from the population. But if the adaptation is successful, the organism thrives, continues on, and the preference of the judges for that sort of adaptation is noted and then modeled in the creation of other contestants in future rounds. They see that this sort of dish or garment or way of singing is favored by the judges, and so that trait begins to propagate through the creations that follow until such time as it begins to become a detriment to survival, at which point it's quickly weeded out. These programs take Darwin's influence on our entertainment to a completely different level. We not only have the brutality of Darwin's Malthusian world, but we see evolution as a random but creative process in which strange new possibilities arise, many being flawed and therefore removed from the population, but others being helpful in a way that become a normal part of the population. Darwin greatly shaped our picture of reality in a way that's remarkable. But biology in the 20th century went well beyond what Darwin could have imagined. And this 19th century redefinition of reality waited a 20th century home makeover.